Andriy Stadnik sits across from the interviewer, his demeanor calm but guarded. The room is bare, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. He begins his story with a simple assertion. I didn't come here to fight. I was just an instructor. His tone is rehearsed, the words delivered with the precision of someone who has recounted this narrative many times. According to Andriy, he was there to train others, not to take part in the violence. I was teaching basic firearm skills, that's all, he says, leaning forward as if to emphasize his innocence. But the interviewer doesn't let the statement stand unchallenged. They ask about his deployment to Ukraine, the missions he participated in, and the circumstances of his capture. Andriy shifts in his seat. I didn't join for ideology, he explains. It was just a job. A way to provide for my family. His words paint a picture of necessity, of a man swept up by circumstances beyond his control. But cracks begin to form in his narrative. When pressed about his role in specific operations, his answers grow evasive, his gaze shifting. He mentions orders, duty, and obligation, but the underlying tone is one of self-preservation. The interviewer's voice cuts through his explanations. You say you didn't want to fight, yet here you are, captured in an active war zone. How do you explain that? Andriy hesitates, his practiced facade faltering for a moment. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he murmurs, almost to himself. This opening sets the stage for the unraveling of Andriy's story, a tale where the lines between victim and perpetrator blur, and the truth lies somewhere between his words and the interviewer's unrelenting questions. Andriy Stadnik was born in 1982 in the quiet town of Kurashov in the Bryansk region, a place defined by its simplicity and the rhythms of rural life. His childhood was shaped by modest comforts, days spent in school, evenings playing with friends, and weekends helping his father in the garage. Andriy speaks of his parents with a mix of pride and longing. His father, a mechanic, was a man of few words but strong principles. His mother, a school teacher, believed in the transformative power of education. They taught me to work hard and stay honest, he recalls. Life wasn't easy, but it was good. Yet even as a child, Andriy felt the weight of limitations. Kurachov, like many small towns, offered little in the way of opportunity. Jobs were scarce, and the future seemed to stretch out in a predictable line of factory work and small-town struggles. I wanted more, he says, reflecting on his teenage years. I dreamed of leaving, of doing something bigger. His chance came with military service. At 18, Andriy was drafted into the army and stationed in Tula. Serving in the 106th Division, he discovered a new world, one of discipline, camaraderie, and structure. The army changed me, he admits. It gave me purpose, even if it was just for a short time. But military life wasn't where Andriy saw his future. After completing his service, he returned home briefly before setting his sights on Moscow. The capital city was a stark contrast to Kurachov. Its bustling streets and towering buildings felt both intimidating and exhilarating. For Andriy, it represented a chance to reinvent himself. He started with small security jobs, standing guard at offices and retail stores. It wasn't glamorous, he says, but it was a start. Over time, Andriy began to dream bigger. He pooled his savings and took a risk, starting a sand quarry business with a partner. It was an ambitious venture, one that he hoped would provide stability and success. For a while, things seemed to go well. The business gained traction, and Andriy started to feel like he was finally achieving something. But Moscow's competitive and often cutthroat environment soon caught up with him. Without powerful connections or the means to navigate the city's unwritten rules, the business began to falter. It wasn't just about working hard, he explains. In Moscow, you needed connections. Political, financial. We didn't have those. By 2017, the sand quarry was in debt, and Andriy was forced to close it down. The collapse of his business marked the beginning of a downward spiral. His marriage ended soon after, leaving him estranged from his wife and struggling to maintain a relationship with his young son. To support himself, Andriy took a position in the security division of the Moscow Ring Railway in 2018. The job provided stability, and for a brief time, he felt like his life was back on track. But the peace was short-lived. A corruption scandal involving senior officials within the company led to his dismissal in 2021. Andriy claims he tried to expose the wrongdoing, but instead, he became a scapegoat. It was like being punished for trying to do the right thing, he says bitterly. By the time recruitment into the Amet Battalion began in late 2021, Andriy was desperate. Living in a small rented apartment, juggling odd jobs to make ends meet, and burdened by a sense of failure. The battalion's promises of financial reward and purpose struck a chord. They said I'd be an instructor, he recalls, teaching others, staying out of the fight. It sounded like a way to make things better, yet sounded like a way to make things better. Yet beneath his words lies a deeper truth. A man searching for redemption in the wrong places, drawn into a conflict he neither fully understood nor questioned. Andrey's life before the war was a series of struggles, each compounding the other, leading him to choices that would later haunt him. The call to join the Akhmet Battalion came at a time when Andrey Stadnik's life was in free fall. By late 2021, his days were a blur of failed job searches and fleeting attempts to find stability. Living paycheck to paycheck, he felt the walls closing in. I needed a way out, he explains, his voice heavy with resignation. I didn't see many options. The battalion's recruiters were persuasive. They painted a picture of purpose, camaraderie, and financial security. They offered a contract with promises of a steady income, 140,000 rubles monthly, nearly double what many earned in regular jobs. Andrey was told he could expect additional bonuses for dangerous missions and combat roles. They made it sound straightforward, he recalls. Train others, keep the peace. No direct fighting unless absolutely necessary. The recruitment process began with a phone call. A former colleague from his days in the Moscow Security Division reached out, recommending him as a candidate for an instructor role. They said they needed experienced men. Andrey says, someone who could teach firearms handling and basic combat skills. His military service in Tula, though 2 decades behind him, was suddenly an asset. Andrey traveled to Grozny for an initial briefing. The atmosphere there was both intimidating and exhilarating. It was my first time in Chechnya, he admits. The energy was intense. Lots of men, all ready to prove themselves. The recruits were a mix of seasoned veterans, young volunteers, and opportunists drawn by the promise of high pay. Ethnic Chechens were in the minority. The battalion was a patchwork of nationalities from across Russia, including Dagestanis, Buryats, and describes the training as rudimentary at best. We spent a few days at a shooting range, firing Kalashnikovs and practicing basic drills, he says. It wasn't what I expected for a unit heading into a conflict zone. There was little focus on strategy or survival skills. The emphasis was on loyalty and readiness to follow orders. They told us the real training would come in the field. It wasn't long before the ideological framing of the mission began to take shape. Recruits were briefed on the importance of liberating Ukraine from what they were told was a neo-Nazi regime. It was the same rhetoric we'd heard on TV, Andrey admits. They talked about protecting Russian-speaking people, about fighting fascism. It was convincing at the time. Still, Andrey's primary motivation wasn't ideology. It was financial survival. The contract promised more than just a paycheck. It offered the hope of clearing debts, providing for his son, and regaining a sense of control over his life. I told myself it was just a job, he says, almost defensively. I wasn't going there to fight. I was going there to fight. I was going there to teach. But even in those early days, Andrey began to sense that the reality might not align with the promises. The chaotic organization of the battalion, the vague instructions, and the hurried preparations all hinted at a lack of structure. It felt more like a patchwork group than an elite unit, he admits. But by then, I was already in. The final leg of the recruitment process involved signing a contract with the Ministry of Defense. Andrey was promised a 3-month deployment, 2 months in Ukraine, and 1 month of rest and rehabilitation back home. He boarded a military transport plane from Grozny to Rostov-on-Don, where the recruits were transferred to buses and taken to a staging area in Luhansk. It was surreal, he says. One day I'm signing papers, and the next I'm in a conflict zone. In those early moments, Andrey tried to hold on to the assurances he'd been given, that he would be an instructor, that the battalion's mission was one of liberation, that the danger would be minimal. But as he crossed into Ukraine, the weight of uncertainty began to settle in. Looking back, he says quietly, I don't think any of us knew what we were really getting into. Andrey's recruitment into the Akhmet Battalion wasn't just the start of his involvement in the war. It was the beginning of a journey that would challenge every belief he held about duty, loyalty, and survival. It was a step into the unknown, driven by desperation and cloaked in promises that would soon unravel. Andrey Stadnik's journey to Ukraine began with a mix of apprehension and determination. The promise of steady pay and a defined role as an instructor had been enough to convince him to sign up. But as he boarded the military transport plane from Grozny to Rostov-on-Don, a creeping sense of unease settled in. It didn't feel real at first, he recalls. like I was part of something big, but I wasn't sure what. The plane was packed with recruits, their conversations a mixture of nervous banter and bravado. Some talked about their expectations of a quick campaign, others traded stories of past deployments. For Andrei, it was an unfamiliar dynamic. He wasn't part of a cohesive unit, but rather a collection of strangers thrown together by circumstance. We didn't know each other, he says. We didn't know what to expect. Upon arrival in Rostov-on-Don, Andrei and the others were transferred to buses, heading toward a staging area in Luhansk. The landscape changed as they crossed into the Donbass region. Small villages, empty roads, and an eerie silence that felt worlds apart from the bustling streets of Moscow he had left behind. It was like entering another world, he describes. A place caught between war and normal life. The staging area was little more than a makeshift camp, rows of tents, scattered vehicles, and a handful of officers barking orders. Andrei remembers the chaos vividly. It was disorganized, he admits. People were arriving from different places with no clear idea of what they were supposed to do. Equipment was handed out haphazardly. Mismatched uniforms, outdated firearms, and supplies that seemed insufficient for what lay ahead. Andrei's first night in Luhansk was restless. The reality of his situation began to sink in. The camp was alive with activity. Generators humming, radios crackling, and men moving between tents. He tried to sleep, but found his mind racing. I kept thinking about my son, he says. What was I doing here? Was this really the right choice? The following morning, Andrei attended his first operational briefing. The officers spoke in broad terms about the mission, securing key areas, supporting local forces, and maintaining control of supply routes. But the details were vague, leaving Andrei and others with more questions than answers. It was clear they didn't have a solid plan, he explains. They were making it up as they went. As the days passed, Andrei began to notice the tension among his fellow recruits. Some were eager to prove themselves, while others were visibly anxious. Rumors spread quickly. Stories of skirmishes, ambushes, and mounting casualties. It was hard to know what was true, Andrei says. But the fear was real. Andrei's role as an instructor was also proving to be less defined than he had been led to believe. He was asked to train a small group of new recruits in basic firearm skills and tactical maneuvers, but the sessions were rushed and poorly attended. It felt like a formality, he recalls. No one seemed to take it seriously. One of the more striking moments during this period came when Andrei overheard a conversation between two officers. They spoke openly about the lack of coordination between units and the challenges of maintaining morale. They didn't think we'd last more than a few weeks, he says. Hearing that was like a punch to the gut. Despite the growing doubts, Andrei pushed forward, driven by the hope that his situation might stabilize. He tried to focus on his tasks, avoiding the bigger questions gnawing at him. But as the days turned into weeks, the reality of the battalion's mission became harder to ignore. The promises of a straightforward, well-organized operation were unraveling, replaced by a chaotic and unpredictable conflict. Crossing into Ukraine had marked a turning point for Andrei, a shift from the theoretical to the tangible. He was no longer just a man seeking financial stability. He was part of a war he neither fully understood nor supported. And as he looked around the camp at the faces of his fellow recruits, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were all walking into something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. I told myself to focus on the job, he says, his voice tinged with regret. But deep down, I knew things weren't going to go the way they promised. Life inside the Amat Battalion was far from what Andrei Stadnik had imagined when he signed up. From the moment he arrived at the staging area in Luhansk, it became clear that this was not the disciplined and well-organized military unit he had expected. Instead, it was a patchwork of individuals, many of whom seemed as unprepared as Andrei felt. The first thing I noticed was the lack of structure, Andrei recalls. There were no proper ranks, no real chain of command. Orders were given, but no one seemed to know who was in charge. The battalion was a mix of seasoned veterans, inexperienced recruits, and opportunists looking for quick money. Some were motivated by ideology, but most, like Andrei, were there for the paycheck. It felt more like a gathering of desperate men than a professional unit, he says. Accommodations were as chaotic as the leadership. Soldiers were crammed into makeshift tents with little regard for space or comfort. Supplies were limited, and essentials like clean water and food were rationed unevenly. Andrei often found himself bartering with fellow soldiers for extra rations or basic necessities. You had to fend for yourself, he explains. It was survival, even within the camp. Weapons and equipment were another source of frustration. While some soldiers were issued modern rifles and body armor, others received outdated and unreliable gear. Andry's own rifle was decades old, prone to jamming, and far from battle-ready. It was a lottery, he says. Some got lucky, and others didn't. I was one of the unlucky ones. Despite these challenges, Andry tried to focus on his role as an instructor. He was tasked with training a small group of recruits in firearm handling and basic combat maneuvers. But the sessions were poorly attended, and the recruits often showed little interest in learning. They were more concerned about when their next paycheck would arrive than about training, he says. It was disheartening. Morale within the battalion was fragile. Tensions flared frequently, fueled by the stressful conditions and lack of cohesion. Arguments over food, equipment, and even sleeping arrangements were common. Fistfights broke out regularly, and the officers seemed powerless, or unwilling, to intervene. It was every man for himself. Andry says, "You couldn't trust anyone." One incident that stood out to Andry involved a young recruit named Timur, barely out of his teens. Timur had been assigned to Andry's training group and was visibly terrified of the prospect of combat. One evening, Andry found him sitting outside the tent, shaking and clutching his rifle. "He told me he wanted to go home," Andry recalls. "He said he'd made a mistake signing up." Andry tried to reassure him, but there was little he could say to ease Timur's fears. A few days later, Timur disappeared. Rumors circulated that he had deserted, but others claimed he had been reassigned to a more dangerous post as punishment for his hesitation. "I never saw him again," Andry says. "It was a reminder that we were all expendable." Despite the dysfunction, there was a shared sense of inevitability among the soldiers. They knew that deployment to the front lines was only a matter of time. Andry began to notice changes in himself. He was becoming more withdrawn, more focused on just getting through each day. "You stop thinking about the bigger picture," he explains. "You just try to survive." The battalion's leadership offered little in the way of inspiration or guidance. Briefings were vague, often leaving soldiers with more questions than answers. Andry recalls one meeting where an officer simply told them to be ready for anything without elaborating on what that meant. It was as if they didn't know what they were doing either, he says. For Andry, the time spent inside the Amet battalion was a mix of disillusionment and resignation. The promises of order, purpose, and security that had lured him in were quickly replaced by the harsh realities of chaos, fear, and mistrust. Yet, even as the cracks in the battalion's foundation became impossible to ignore, Andry held on to the hope that his role as an instructor would keep him out of direct combat. It was a hope that would soon be shattered. "You try to convince yourself that it'll get better," he says, "but deep down you know it won't." Andry Stadnik's first encounters with Ukrainian civilians were nothing like what he had been led to expect. Before deploying, he and his fellow recruits were briefed extensively on their mission: to liberate the local population from oppression and fascism. We were told they'd welcome us. Andry recalls that they'd see us as protectors, but the reality on the ground was far from the rosy picture painted by the battalion's commanders. The first village they entered was a small settlement on the outskirts of Luhansk. The streets were eerily quiet, the homes shuttered. Andry and his unit moved cautiously, their eyes scanning for any sign of resistance. At first, it seemed deserted, he says. No one came out to greet us, no signs of life. Eventually, they encountered a few villagers, elderly residents who had stayed behind while younger family members fled. Andry approached a man sitting on his porch, his hands trembling as he clutched a cane. "We told him we were here to help," Andry says. "He just looked at us, his face blank. He didn't say a word." As more villagers emerged, their reactions ranged from cautious silence to open hostility. Some muttered under their breath, while others avoided the soldiers altogether. One woman, clutching a child, spat on the ground as they passed. "I didn't understand it at first," Andry admits. "I thought, why are they angry? We're here to protect them." It wasn't long before the reason became clear. The battalion had been instructed to search homes for suspected resistance fighters and hidden weapons. Andry remembers the discomfort he felt as they entered one house after another, overturning furniture and rifling through belongings. "We didn't find anything," he says, "but the damage was done. These people didn't see us as liberators, they saw us as invaders." One encounter left a particularly deep impression on Andry. His unit entered the home of an elderly couple who refused to leave. The woman begged them not to destroy their family photographs, which were strewn across the floor during the search. She was crying, Andry recalls, and the man kept saying, "We have nothing. We're just old people. "Why are you doing this?" Andrei tried to calm them, but his words felt hollow. "What could I say?" he asks. "We were invading their home. Over time, the hostility of the civilians became harder to ignore. In one village, a group of women confronted the soldiers, shouting and accusing them of bringing destruction. One woman stepped forward, pointing at a nearby school that had been damaged in a previous skirmish. She said, 'This was for our children. Now look at it.' Andrei remembers the embarrassment he felt in that moment, unable to meet her gaze. There was nothing I could say. Not all interactions were openly hostile. Some civilians remained silent, resigned to the presence of the soldiers. Others tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, tending to their gardens or walking to the local well as if the war wasn't happening. But even in their silence, Andrei felt the weight of their disapproval. It was in their eyes, he says. They didn't need to say anything. You could feel it. Andrei's perception of the mission began to shift during these encounters. The stories he'd been told about liberating Ukraine no longer matched the reality before him. They didn't want us there, he says. They weren't happy to see us. It was the opposite. One of the most striking moments came when his unit encountered a young boy, no older than 10, standing in the middle of the road. He was holding a small wooden stick, pretending it was a rifle. He pointed it at us like he was playing soldier. Andrei recalls. But the look on his face wasn't playful. It was defiance. That image stayed with Andrei, a stark reminder of how deeply the war had scarred the local population. These weren't people we were saving, he says. They were people we were hurting. As the days went on, Andrei grew more withdrawn. The gulf between what he had been promised and what he was experiencing widened with every encounter. It's hard to explain, he says. You start to realize you're part of something wrong. But by then, it's too late to change it. Andrei's first encounters with Ukrainian civilians marked a turning point in his journey. They were no longer nameless figures in a propaganda narrative. They were people, angry, frightened, and resilient, standing in quiet defiance of the soldiers who claimed to be their liberators. Life in the trenches was a harsh and unrelenting ordeal that tested every fiber of Andrei Stadnik's resolve. The promises of a clean, structured mission had long since crumbled, replaced by the gritty and unforgiving realities of war. Andrei's unit, stationed on the outskirts of a contested village, was tasked with holding their position while fending off sporadic attacks from Ukrainian forces. The trenches were barely trenches, Andrei explains. They were shallow ditches hastily dug into the frozen ground. You couldn't stand, and you couldn't lie down comfortably. You were just there, cramped and exposed. The conditions were grueling. Cold winds sliced through their clothing, and the damp earth seeped into their bones. Supplies were scarce, and meals consisted of whatever rations could be scavenged or delivered. Water was often tainted, and the risk of illness loomed over the soldiers as much as the threat of enemy fire. There were days when even a stale piece of bread felt like a luxury. Andrei recalls, "You learn not to expect anything." The psychological strain was equally punishing. Days blurred into nights as Andrei and his comrades took turns on watch, scanning the horizon for signs of movement. Sleep was a rare commodity, often interrupted by the distant rumble of artillery or the crack of rifle fire. You never truly rested, Andrei says. Your body was exhausted, but your mind wouldn't let you relax. Morale in the trenches was a fragile thing, constantly eroded by fear and uncertainty. Arguments over rations, shifts, and tactics were common, and tempers flared easily in the confined space. Andrei recalls one incident where a disagreement over sentry duty escalated into a fistfight. It didn't take much for things to boil over, he says. We were all on edge. Adding to the tension was the lack of communication from higher command. Orders were infrequent and often vague, leaving the soldiers to rely on their instincts and makeshift plans. We felt abandoned, Andrei admits. Like no one really cared what happened to us out there. One of the most harrowing moments came during a nighttime skirmish. Ukrainian forces launched a surprise assault on their position, and chaos erupted in the trenches. Andrei remembers the deafening roar of gunfire and the panicked shouts of his comrades. You couldn't see much in the dark, he says. You just fired at shadows and hoped you hit something. During the attack, a young soldier named Pavel was hit by shrapnel. Andrei and another soldier dragged him to a makeshift shelter, where they attempted to stop the bleeding. We didn't have proper medical supplies, Andrei says, his voice heavy with guilt. We used whatever we could find, pieces of cloth, even dirt, to try and patch him up. Pavel didn't survive the night. The loss of Pavel had a profound impact on Andrei, It wasn't just the death itself. It was the helplessness of the situation, the inability to save a comrade despite their best efforts. It made everything feel pointless, he says. We were just bodies in a hole, waiting for our turn. Despite the grim conditions, there were moments of grim humor and camaraderie that offered brief respites. Soldiers would share stories about their lives back home, joke about their misfortune, or even engage in impromptu games using whatever scraps they could find. It was our way of staying sane, Andrei says. Even if just for a moment. Andrei's time in the trenches was defined by a growing sense of disillusionment. The promises of liberation and honor that had brought him to Ukraine felt like distant echoes, drowned out by the stark reality of survival. You don't think about the bigger picture when you're in the trenches, he says. You just think about making it to the next day. The trenches stripped away any illusions Andrei had about the war. They were a microcosm of everything wrong with the mission, chaotic, dehumanizing, and devoid of purpose. And as Andrei sat in the freezing mud, clutching his rifle and staring into the darkness, he couldn't help but wonder how long he could endure. The Amat battalion was riddled with structural issues that became painfully evident once they were deployed. For Andrei Stadnik, the lack of cohesive leadership wasn't just frustrating. It was dangerous. The battalion was a fragmented collection of individuals from varying backgrounds, thrown together without clear roles or responsibilities. It was chaos, Andrei recalls. No one seemed to know who was in charge, and when orders came, they were often contradictory. The battalion's leadership structure was nominally in place, but in practice, it was anything but functional. Mid-level officers were either inexperienced or indifferent, while higher-ranking commanders remained distant, rarely interacting with the men on the ground. Decisions often fell to squad leaders, who themselves were struggling to make sense of unclear directives. We were told to hold positions or secure the area. Andrei explains, but what that actually meant was never clear. Communication between units was sporadic at best. Radios were frequently unreliable, either due to outdated equipment or interference from nearby combat zones. Messages often came too late to be of any use. Andrei remembers one instance when his unit was ordered to prepare for an enemy advance, only to learn hours later that the threat had already passed. It made us feel like pawns on a chessboard, he says. Expendable and uninformed. The lack of coordination extended to supplies as well. Food, ammunition, and medical kits were distributed unevenly, leading to resentment among soldiers. Some units received adequate provisions, while others were left to scavenge. Andrei's unit frequently ran low on basic necessities, forcing them to rely on improvised solutions. We'd trade cigarettes for canned food with other units, he says. It wasn't sustainable, but it was the only way to get by. One of the most glaring examples of the command structure's failure came during a patrol operation. Andrei's unit was ordered to scout a nearby village suspected of harboring resistance fighters. They were given a vague map, no backup, and little information about what to expect. We were essentially sent blind, Andrei says. No intel, no support, nothing. The patrol quickly turned into a disaster. The village was empty, but as they moved through the area, they came under sniper fire from the surrounding hills, without clear instructions or reinforcements. The unit was forced to retreat in disarray. Andrei vividly remembers the panic as they scrambled for cover. We didn't know where the shots were coming from, he says. It was every man for himself. In the aftermath, Andrei's unit received no acknowledgement from their commanders, let alone any form of debriefing. We just moved on like it never happened, he says. There was no accountability, no effort to learn from mistakes. It was like no one cared. The lack of leadership also bred tension among the soldiers. Without strong authority figures to mediate disputes or enforce discipline, the men often took matters into their own hands. Arguments over rations, patrol rotations, and personal grievances escalated into physical altercations. Andrei recalls one fight between two soldiers that left both bloodied and bruised. It was like a free-for-all, he says. People were losing their grip. Perhaps the most demoralizing aspect of the shaky command structure was the pervasive sense of expendability. Soldiers were given tasks with little regard for their safety or the larger strategy. Andrei describes feeling like a disposable asset in a game he didn't understand. We weren't soldiers, we were cannon fodder, he says. That's how they treated us. The absence of effective leadership took a toll on Andrei, amplifying his doubts about the mission. He began to question not just the competence of his commanders, but the very purpose of the war. If they didn't care about us, why were we even there? He asks. It made no sense. For Andrei, The shaky command structure was emblematic of the deeper flaws within the operation. It wasn't just a logistical failure. It was a reflection of a mission that lacked clarity, cohesion, and humanity. And as the cracks in the battalion's foundation widened, Andrei found himself grappling with the unsettling realization that they were fighting a war they weren't equipped to win, or even survive. Key missions were the backbone of the Akhmat Battalion's operations, and for Andrei Stadnik, they were also the source of some of his most vivid and harrowing memories. These missions, often poorly planned and executed, left behind a trail of chaos, fear, and lingering questions about their purpose. Every mission felt like a gamble. Andrei recalls, "We were rolling the dice every time we left the camp. One of the first major operations Andrei participated in was a sweep and secure mission in a contested village near Lysychansk. The battalion was tasked with rooting out suspected resistance fighters and establishing a foothold in the area. On paper, the mission seemed straightforward. Advance into the village, search for hidden fighters or weapons, and secure the perimeter. But as Andrei and his comrades moved in, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. The village was almost empty when we arrived," Andrei explains. But that didn't mean it was safe. As they began their sweep, sporadic gunfire erupted from hidden positions. It wasn't a coordinated ambush, but the effect was the same: chaos. Soldiers scattered, taking cover wherever they could find it, while officers shouted conflicting orders. "We didn't know where the fire was coming from," Andrei says. "It felt like we were walking into a trap." The mission ended with heavy casualties on both sides and no clear gains. Andrei's unit managed to recover a few outdated rifles and some ammunition from an abandoned house, but it was hardly worth the cost. "It was a mess," he says. "We lost men. And for what? A few rusty weapons." The aftermath of the operation was even more disheartening. Commanders refused to acknowledge the missteps or provide a clear explanation of the mission's objectives. Instead, they framed the operation as a success in their reports, touting the capture of enemy equipment. They spun it into propaganda, Andrei says. But we knew the truth. It wasn't a victory. It was survival. Another mission that left a lasting mark on Andrei involved a nighttime raid on a suspected supply depot. The intelligence was sketchy, and the orders were vague. Infiltrate the area, confirm the presence of supplies, and seize what they could. Andrei's unit moved under the cover of darkness, relying on maps that turned out to be outdated and incomplete. "We got lost almost immediately," Andrei recalls. "The terrain didn't match the maps, and the landmarks we were supposed to use weren't there. The unit eventually stumbled upon what they believed to be the depot, a cluster of small warehouses on the outskirts of a village. But as they approached, they realized they had been spotted. Flares lit up the sky, and within moments, they were under heavy fire. The raid devolved into a chaotic retreat. Soldiers scrambled to escape, leaving behind equipment and even some wounded comrades in the process. Andrei managed to find cover behind a broken-down truck, firing blindly into the darkness as bullets whizzed past him. "I thought I was going to die," he says. "It was pure chaos. By the time the unit regrouped, they had lost several men and gained nothing. The depot turned out to be an abandoned storage facility with no strategic value." Andrei couldn't shake the feeling that the mission had been doomed from the start. "It felt like they were sending us on suicide runs," he says. "No plan, no backup, just blind orders." One of the most morally complex missions Andrei participated in was an intimidation operation targeting a local community suspected of harboring resistance. Fighters. The battalion was ordered to make a show of force, patrol the streets, interrogate villagers, and leave no doubt about who was in control. It wasn't combat, Andrei says. It was theater. Andrei remembers entering a small home where an elderly woman and her teenage grandson were sitting silently. The soldiers searched the house, tossing furniture and belongings aside as the woman pleaded for them to stop. She kept saying, "We have nothing. Please don't take anything," Andrei recalls. The soldiers found no weapons, but before leaving, one of them smashed a family portrait on the floor. The woman's sobs echoed as they walked out. It felt wrong, Andrei says, but no one said anything. "We just did what we were told." The fallout from these missions weighed heavily on Andrei and his comrades. Soldiers became more withdrawn, more cynical. Trust in leadership eroded further with each operation that ended in failure or unnecessary suffering. "We started questioning everything," Andrei admits. Why were we here? What were we really accomplishing? For Andrei, the missions were a turning point. They exposed the futility of the battalion's efforts and the moral compromises required to carry them out. Each operation chipped away at the promises of liberation and purpose, leaving behind a grim reality of survival and complicity. You start to lose pieces of yourself, Andry says quietly. Every mission, every order, it takes something from you. And after a while, there's not much left. The early signs of Andry Stadnik's disillusionment began to surface not long after his deployment. At first, he tried to rationalize the chaos and contradictions he encountered, telling himself that the confusion was temporary, that the battalion would find its footing, and that their mission would eventually bring the promised results. But as the weeks dragged on, the cracks in his beliefs became impossible to ignore. It started with the civilians, Andry recalls. They didn't see us as liberators. They saw us as occupiers. His encounters with villagers, filled with mistrust and quiet defiance, planted the first seeds of doubt. The rhetoric about freeing Ukraine no longer held weight when faced with the reality of frightened, resentful faces. You can't help but question it when people spit at you instead of thanking you, he says. The lack of leadership and direction was another blow to his morale. Every mission seemed more disorganized than the last, and Andry began to notice the toll it was taking on his comrades. Soldiers who had once been eager to prove themselves were now growing bitter and withdrawn. Arguments broke out more frequently, and the camaraderie that had briefly united them began to fray. You could feel it, Andry says. People were losing faith, not just in the commanders, but in the entire operation. One moment that stood out to Andry occurred during a supply run to a nearby unit. His group had been tasked with delivering rations and ammunition, but when they arrived, the receiving unit was visibly angered by the meager supplies. They accused us of taking more than our share, Andry recalls. It almost came to blows. The incident left a bitter taste in his mouth, highlighting the deep mistrust even within their own forces. We weren't a battalion, he says. We were just a group of men trying to survive. As the missions continued, the propaganda that had been fed to the soldiers began to feel hollow. Andry recalls one briefing where a commander spoke passionately about their duty to protect Russian-speaking Ukrainians from supposed oppression. But when pressed for specifics, the commander faltered, offering vague explanations and deflecting questions. It was all words, Andry says. No substance, no truth. The conditions in the trenches also played a role in Andry's growing disillusionment. The cold, the hunger, the constant fear, they wore down even the most hardened soldiers. Andry began to notice the subtle ways his comrades were coping, from quiet prayers whispered at night to the desperate letters they wrote to families back home. You could see it in their faces, he says. No one believed we were making a difference. One of the most profound moments of doubt came after a nighttime skirmish. Andry's unit had been caught off guard by a small group of Ukrainian fighters, resulting in casualties on both sides. After the fighting subsided, Andry found himself staring at the body of a young Ukrainian soldier, no older than 20. He looked like a kid, Andry says softly, just lying there in the mud, with his rifle still in his hand. The sight haunted Andry for days. He couldn't stop thinking about the soldier's family, about the life that had been cut short for reasons that no longer felt justified. I kept asking myself, why are we doing this? He says. Why are we here? Andry's disillusionment didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, through small moments and mounting frustrations, until it became an undeniable truth. The war he had signed up for was not the one he was fighting, and the promises of purpose and liberation had turned into a grim reality of survival and regret. You try to hold on to something. Anything, Andry says. But when everything feels wrong, it's hard to keep going. The failed operation that marked a turning point in Andry Stadnik's time with the Amet Battalion began with vague orders and high tension. His unit was tasked with securing a critical supply route near a contested area on the outskirts of Lysychansk. Intelligence reports claimed that Ukrainian forces had been using the route to transport weapons and reinforcements, and the mission was clear on paper. Ambush the convoy, neutralize any threats, and hold the position. But the planning left much to be desired. We were given a map, some basic instructions, and told to handle it, Andry recalls. No backup, no contingency plans. Just a lot of hope that things would work out. The operation began under the cover of night, with Andry and his comrades moving through dense woodland to reach the supply route. The journey itself was a grueling ordeal. The terrain was uneven, the cold biting through their thin uniforms. Carrying their weapons and limited supplies, they trudged forward in silence, their only guide a dim flashlight held by the squad leader. It felt like we were walking blind, Andry says. No one really knew where we were going. By the time they reached the designated position, exhaustion had already set in. The squad hastily set up an ambush, positioning themselves along the roadside behind a cluster of bushes and fallen trees. The plan was simple: wait for the convoy, attack swiftly, and secure any supplies. But as the hours passed with no sign of activity, doubt began to creep in. We were freezing, tired, and hungry, Andrew recalls. And the longer we waited, the more it felt like something was off. The tension finally broke in the early hours of the morning. A faint rumble of engines echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The soldiers readied their weapons, their breaths visible in the frosty air. But as the convoy came into view, Andrew immediately realized they were outmatched. It wasn't just a few trucks, he says. It was an entire column, heavily armed and clearly expecting trouble. What followed was chaos. The squad opened fire, but their poorly coordinated attack was met with a swift and overwhelming response. The convoy's defenders unleashed a barrage of gunfire, pinning the soldiers down and forcing them to scatter. It was every man for himself, Andrew says. People were running, shouting, trying to find cover. Andrew took shelter behind a large rock, his heart pounding as bullets zipped past him. He returned fire sporadically, barely able to see his targets in the dim light. Around him, the sounds of the skirmish were deafening: explosions, gunfire, and the screams of wounded soldiers. It was pure chaos, he says. You couldn't think. You just reacted. Amid the confusion, Andrew noticed one of his comrades, a young soldier named Sergei, lying wounded in the open. Without thinking, Andrew crawled toward him, dragging Sergei behind the rock and trying to stop the bleeding with a torn piece of cloth. He was hit in the leg, Andrew says. He kept saying, "Don't let me die here." But with no medical supplies and the firefight still raging, there was little Andrew could do. As the situation deteriorated, the squad leader ordered a retreat. Soldiers scrambled to pull back, leaving behind their equipment and the wounded who couldn't be carried. Andrew helped Sergei to his feet, half carrying, half dragging him as they made their way through the woods. The retreat was disorganized and desperate, with soldiers splitting into smaller groups to evade pursuit. It was every man for himself, Andrew says. We didn't even know where the others were. By the time Andrew and Sergei reached what they believed to be a safe distance, the sun was rising, casting an eerie light over the blood-soaked ground they had just fled. Sergei was pale and barely conscious, and Andrew knew they needed help. But with no communication equipment and no clear idea of where they were effectively stranded. We were lost, Andrew says, and there was no one coming to save us. The failed operation left a lasting impact on Andrew. It wasn't just the physical toll of the skirmish or the loss of comrades. It was the overwhelming sense of futility. We were sent out there with no plan, no support, and no chance of success, he says. And for what? A supply route we never even secured. The fallout from the mission only deepened Andrew's disillusionment. The commanders offered no explanations or apologies, instead framing the retreat as a strategic regrouping. They acted like it was part of the plan, Andrew says bitterly. But we knew better, for Andrew. The failed operation was a turning point, a moment when the full weight of the war's senselessness became undeniable. The promises of purpose and liberation had given way to a grim reality of disorganization, loss, and survival. That night, something changed in me, he says. I stopped believing in the mission. I just wanted to get out alive. The moment Andrew Stadnik was injured marked a turning point in his journey, a physical and emotional blow that laid bare the brutal realities of war and the indifference of those he once considered comrades. It happened during yet another poorly planned mission, this time an attempt to secure a hilltop position near a strategic crossroads. The terrain was rugged, the weather cold and unforgiving, and the soldiers were already worn thin from weeks of inadequate rest and supplies. We were told it was a simple operation, Andrew recalls. Move in, secure the area, and hold it until reinforcements arrived. But nothing about it was simple. The unit began their ascent in the early hours of the morning, navigating the rocky terrain under the faint light of a clouded moon. Every step felt like a struggle, their heavy gear weighing them down as they climbed. The hill offered no cover, leaving them exposed to any potential enemy fire. Halfway to the summit, the ambush came. Bullets rained down from unseen positions, and the soldiers scrambled for whatever cover they could find. Andrew remembers the sound vividly, the crack of rifles, the shouts of his comrades, and the deafening roar of an explosion that tore through the silence. It was chaos, he says. You couldn't see where the shots were coming from. You just tried to stay alive. Andrew was hit as he moved to help a fellow soldier who had fallen. A searing pain shot through his leg, and he collapsed to the ground. It felt like my entire body was on fire, he says. I looked down and saw the blood soaking through my pants. That's when I knew I was in trouble. The wound wasn't immediately life-threatening, but it left him unable to walk. He dragged himself to a nearby rock for cover, gritting his teeth against the pain. As the firefight continued, Andrei called out for help. A few soldiers glanced in his direction, but no one stopped. They were too busy trying to save themselves, he says. I don't blame them. In that kind of situation, survival comes first. Minutes felt like hours as Andrei lay there, clutching his leg and trying to keep his head down. The sounds of battle began to fade as the soldiers retreated, leaving him behind. The realization that he had been abandoned hit Andrei harder than the bullet. I kept thinking, they'll come back for me, he says. But as the minutes dragged on, I knew they wouldn't. The pain in his leg was worsening, and he could feel himself growing weaker from blood loss. He tore a piece of cloth from his jacket and tied it around his leg in a makeshift tourniquet, hoping to slow the bleeding. I didn't know if it would work, he says, but I had to try something. The night was cold, and Andrei's body began to shake uncontrollably. With no supplies and no way to move, he was left to his thoughts, replaying the events that had led him to this point. I thought about my son, he says quietly. I wondered if I'd ever see him again, if he'd ever know what happened to me. As dawn broke, Andrei heard voices in the distance. At first, he thought it was his unit returning to retrieve him, but as the voices grew louder, he realized they weren't speaking Russian. Ukrainian soldiers were approaching, and Andrei's heart raced. I didn't know what they would do to me, he says. Would they take me prisoner, or just finish me off? When the soldiers found him, Andrei raised his hands in surrender, too weak to do anything else. To his surprise, they didn't harm him. Instead, they called for a medic, who bandaged his wound and gave him water. I couldn't believe it, he says. I thought they'd hate me, but they treated me like a human being. Andrei's capture was a strange mixture of relief and shame. He was alive, but the fact that he had been abandoned by his own unit stung deeply. It was humiliating, he says. To be left behind by the people you fought beside, and then saved by the ones you were told were your enemies. The injury and abandonment were more than just physical and tactical failures. They were a breaking point for Andrei. It was the moment when he truly understood the hollow nature of the war he had been fighting. I realized then that no one cared, he says. Not my commanders, not my comrades. I was just another expendable body in a war that didn't make sense. As Andrei recounts this chapter of his story, there's a bitterness in his voice, but also a quiet resilience. I should have died on that hill, he says, but I didn't. And for that, I'm grateful, even if it came at the cost of everything I thought I believed in. The moment of Andrei Stadnik's capture was one of stark vulnerability and reluctant relief. After hours of lying injured on the hillside, exposed to the elements and wrestling with the crushing realization that his unit had abandoned him, he knew his options were limited. His leg throbbed with pain, his makeshift tourniquet barely holding, and his strength was waning. I thought about ending it, he admits. I didn't want to be tortured or left to bleed out. The sounds of approaching footsteps broke through his haze of despair. At first, he thought it might be his comrades returning at last to retrieve him, but the voices carried a different cadence, foreign to his ears but unmistakably Ukrainian. Fear shot through him. I froze, Andrei recalls. I thought, this is it. They'll find me and finish me off. The soldiers moved cautiously, their weapons at the ready as they approached his position. Andrei could see the faint outlines of their figures in the morning light, their uniforms blending into the terrain. He raised his hands weakly, palms up, the universal gesture of surrender. I didn't even have the strength to speak, he says. I just hoped they'd see I wasn't a threat. When the Ukrainian soldiers reached him, they didn't fire. Instead, they surrounded him, their expressions a mixture of wariness and curiosity. One of them, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, crouched beside Andrei and inspected his leg. The makeshift tourniquet had slowed the bleeding, but the wound was severe and infection was a looming threat. He didn't say much, Andrei remembers. He just called for a medic. The medic arrived a few minutes later, carrying a small kit and wearing an expression of calm professionalism. He worked quickly, cleaning the wound and applying fresh bandages while the other soldiers kept their weapons trained on Andrei. I was terrified, Andrei admits, but at the same time I couldn't believe they were helping me. As they stabilized him, the soldiers began asking questions. Who was he? Which unit was he with? What was his mission? Andrei answered cautiously, aware that anything he said could be used against him. I told them I was just an instructor, he says, that I wasn't here to fight. I didn't know if they believed me. Despite the tension, the Ukrainian soldiers treated him with a surprising degree of humanity. They gave him water, allowed him to rest for a moment, and even carried him on a makeshift stretcher down the hillside. Andrei couldn't help but feel a sense of bitter irony. The people I was told were my enemies were the ones who saved me. he says. And the ones who were supposed to be my comrades had left me to die. As they transported him to a makeshift field station, Andry's mind raced with thoughts of what would come next. Would he be tortured? Killed? Paraded as a trophy? His fears intensified when they reached their destination, a small camp where other prisoners were being held. The sight of captured Russian soldiers, their faces gaunt and weary, sent a chill down his spine. I thought, this is where it ends, he says. But once again, Andry was met with a level of care he hadn't expected. The medics cleaned his wound again and administered antibiotics to stave off infection. He was given food, water, and even a blanket. The treatment wasn't luxurious, but it was humane, something Andry hadn't anticipated after years of hearing propaganda about Ukrainian brutality. It was hard to reconcile, he says. Everything I'd been told about them was wrong. Over the following hours, Andry's initial fear gave way to a complicated mixture of gratitude and shame. Gratitude for being alive, for the unexpected kindness of his captors. Shame for the role he had played in the invasion, and the decisions that had led him to this point. I started to question everything, he says. Why was I here? What was I fighting for? And why were the people I was supposed to be saving treating me better than my own side? The moment of capture was a turning point for Andry, a moment when the stark realities of the war collided with the narratives he had been fed. It was a humbling experience, one that forced him to confront the consequences of his choices and the fragility of the ideologies that had brought him to Ukraine. I was their enemy, he says quietly. But they didn't treat me like one. That's something I'll never forget. The first hours of Andry Stadnik's captivity were a blur of pain, fear, and reluctant reflection. After being carried to a makeshift field station, he was placed on a thin cot in a tent that served as both a medical facility and a holding area for injured prisoners. His leg throbbed with pain despite the fresh bandages and antibiotics administered by the Ukrainian medics. Around him, other captured soldiers lay in varying states of disarray, some nursing wounds, others sitting quietly, their faces blank with shock. I didn't know what to expect, Andry recalls. I'd been told that Ukrainian forces were brutal, that they wouldn't take prisoners. But here I was, alive and being treated. The environment was tense, yet there was no overt cruelty from his captors. Instead, the Ukrainian soldiers maintained a strict but fair demeanor. They asked questions about his unit and mission, pressing him for information without resorting to physical violence. Andry answered cautiously, providing just enough to avoid suspicion, but holding back details he thought might endanger his comrades. Despite their earlier abandonment, it was strange, he admits. I felt no loyalty to them anymore, but I still couldn't betray them outright. As the hours passed, Andry found himself reflecting on the path that had brought him to this point. Lying on the cot, staring at the canvas ceiling of the tent, he replayed the decisions that had led him from his small hometown in Bryansk to this foreign battlefield. He thought about his son, now thousands of kilometers away, unaware of his father's fate. I kept wondering what he would think of me if he knew, Andry says. Would he be proud? Ashamed. Would he even understand? The contrast between the propaganda that had lured him into the war and the reality of his situation weighed heavily on him. He remembered the promises of glory and purpose, the rhetoric about liberating Ukraine from neo-Nazis, but the faces of the civilians he had encountered, the fear, the anger, the defiance, told a different story. It was all lies, he says bitterly. We weren't liberators. Andry's reflections weren't limited to his own actions. He also thought about the other prisoners around him, many of whom were barely older than teenagers. One young man, no more than 19, sat clutching a small photograph of his family. Andry watched as the boy quietly wept, trying to hide his tears from the others. It broke something in me, Andry admits. He should have been at home, going to school, living his life. Instead, he was here, just like me, caught up in something none of us really understood. The medics occasionally checked on him, ensuring his wound was stable. Their professionalism and lack of hostility left Andry conflicted. These were the people he had been told to hate, yet they treated him with more humanity than many of his own commanders had. It was hard to process, he says. Everything I'd believed about them was crumbling. One of the most humbling moments came when a Ukrainian soldier brought him a piece of bread and a cup of water. Andry thanked him quietly, unsure of how else to respond. The soldier simply nodded and walked away, leaving Andry alone with his thoughts. That small act of kindness. It stayed with me, he says. It made me realize how little I understood about this war, about these people. In the quiet moments between interrogations and medical checkups, Andry's thoughts turned inward. He questioned his motivations for joining the war, the choices he had made, and the values he had claimed to uphold. I told myself it was about providing for my family, he says. But was it worth it? The money, the promises, it all felt meaningless now. As night fell, Andrew struggled to sleep. The sounds of distant gunfire and the occasional murmur of guards outside the tent reminded him of the conflict still raging beyond his small sanctuary. Yet, for the first time in weeks, he felt a strange sense of peace. I wasn't fighting anymore, he says. I wasn't running. I was just there. Andrew's initial captivity was more than a physical ordeal. It was a period of profound self-reflection. Stripped of the chaos of battle and the lies that had fueled his actions, he was left with nothing but his thoughts and the slow, painful realization of what the war had cost him, not just in blood, but in dignity, trust, and purpose. The interview began with an air of quiet tension. Andrew Stadnik, still weak from his injuries and mentally reeling from his capture, was escorted into a small, dimly lit room. A table and 2 chairs were the only furniture, and the starkness of the setting made it clear. This was no casual conversation. Across from him sat the Ukrainian officer who would conduct the questioning, a man whose calm demeanor belied the gravity of the situation. I knew this was coming, Andrew says. They wanted answers, and I had nothing to give them. Nothing that could justify what I'd done or why I was there. The officer started with simple questions: name, rank, and affiliation. Andrew provided the basics without hesitation. There was no point in lying about that, he explains. They already knew who I was. But as the questions turned to his unit's operations and objectives, Andrew hesitated. The officer noticed immediately, leaning forward and speaking in a measured tone. We already know much of the truth, he said. What we want is your truth. The phrase caught Andrew off guard. My truth. What could he say that wouldn't sound hollow or self-serving? He defaulted to the narrative he had clung to since his capture. I wasn't a fighter, he said. I was just an instructor. I didn't want to hurt anyone. The officer listened silently, his expression unreadable. When Andrew finished, the room was quiet for a moment before the officer replied. And yet, you were there. The officer began to challenge Andrew's statements, dissecting his words with precision. He asked about Andrew's role in the battalion, the missions he had participated in, and the orders he had followed. Each question cut deeper, forcing Andrew to confront the contradictions in his story. I tried to keep it vague, Andrew admits. But he wasn't letting anything slide. At one point, the officer pulled out a map, marking the locations of several key operations that Andrew's unit had been involved in. He pointed to one village and asked about the civilians who had been displaced during a sweep and secure mission. Andrew shifted uncomfortably. I told him I didn't know anything about it, he says. But he didn't believe me. The officer then brought up specific incidents: homes ransacked, families interrogated, and property destroyed. Andrew's heart sank as he realized the depth of the knowledge his captors already possessed. They knew everything, he says. There was no hiding from it. As the interview continued, the officer shifted his focus to Andrew's motivations. Why had he joined the battalion? Why had he agreed to come to Ukraine? Andrew repeated the justification he had told himself from the beginning. It was about providing for his family. I needed the money, he said. It wasn't about politics. The officer's reply was sharp but not unkind. Do you think that excuses what you've done? That a paycheck makes this acceptable? The question hung in the air, and for the first time, Andrew struggled to find an answer. I didn't know what to say, he admits, because deep down, I knew he was right. The interviewer wasn't trying to berate Andrew. Instead, he seemed intent on understanding him. At one point, he asked a question that caught Andrew completely off guard. Do you believe in the mission you were part of? The simplicity of the question struck a nerve. Andrew hesitated before answering, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know anymore. The officer leaned back in his chair, studying Andrew carefully. That's at least honest, he said. But it doesn't erase what's happened. Throughout the interview, Andrew felt the weight of the officer's calm but unyielding scrutiny. He wasn't being yelled at or threatened, but the steady stream of questions forced him to confront parts of himself he had been avoiding. It was like he could see right through me, Andrew says. Every excuse, every lie I told myself, it all sounded hollow when I said it out loud. The session ended with the officer placing a folder on the table. Inside were documents and photographs detailing the actions of the Ahmet Battalion. We have your story now, the officer said as he stood to leave. But what we do with it depends on you. As Andrew was escorted back to his holding area, his mind raced. The interview had forced him to face uncomfortable truths. Not just about the war, but about himself. I realized that I couldn't keep hiding behind excuses, he says, but admitting the truth felt like betraying everything I thought I stood for. The interview was only the beginning of Andrew's reckoning. It was a moment of forced introspection, where the weight of his choices and their consequences began to settle in. And though he didn't have all the answers yet, one thing was clear. The story was no longer just his to tell. As the days of captivity unfolded, the contradictions in Andrei Stadnik's narrative began to unravel during subsequent interviews. His captors, armed with detailed intelligence and first-hand accounts from the field, systematically dismantled the story he had constructed to shield himself. What began as an attempt to justify his actions became a confrontation with the uncomfortable truths he had avoided for so long. They didn't yell or threaten, Andrei recalls, but their questions were relentless. Every time I thought I had an answer, they had a fact that made it impossible to defend. One of the first contradictions they exposed was his claim that he had been just an instructor. Andrei had repeated this line in nearly every conversation since his capture, emphasizing that his role was non-combative, but the officers presented evidence of his participation in operations that went far beyond training. They brought up records of missions his unit had undertaken, including specific instances where he had been seen carrying a weapon and actively engaging. They had dates, locations, even photos, Andrei says. There was no denying it. Faced with this evidence, Andrei attempted to reframe his involvement, suggesting that he had been coerced into participating. I told them I didn't have a choice, he says, that I was following orders. But this defense only led to more pointed questions. The officers pressed him on the nature of those orders, asking whether he had ever questioned their legitimacy or refused to carry them out. Andrei hesitated. The truth is, I didn't question them, he admits. I just did what I was told. It seemed easier that way. The contradictions in his motivations also came under scrutiny. Andrei had repeatedly stated that he joined the Amat Battalion for financial reasons, insisting that his actions were driven by necessity, not ideology. But the officers challenged him on this point, citing the battalion's explicit political and propagandistic goals. They asked me if I really believed it was just about the money, Andrei says, and honestly, I didn't know how to answer. The officers highlighted instances where Andrei had echoed the rhetoric of the battalion, speaking about liberating Ukraine and fighting fascism. These statements, recorded during briefings and captured in intercepted communications, stood in stark contrast to his claim that he had no ideological stake in the conflict. They showed me my own words, Andrei says, and it was hard to argue with myself. Perhaps the most damning contradiction came when the officers confronted Andrei about his interactions with civilians. He had initially portrayed himself as a passive participant, someone who had avoided direct harm to non-combatants. But witness accounts and reports from the field painted a different picture. They described his involvement in searches, interrogations, and operations that left homes destroyed and families displaced. They asked me how I could reconcile that with the idea of just doing my job, Andrei says. And I didn't have an answer. One particular moment during the interrogation struck a deep nerve. The officers described an elderly couple whose home had been ransacked during one of Andrei's missions. The couple had reportedly begged the soldiers to leave their belongings untouched, only to have their pleas ignored. Andrei remembered the incident vividly. It was one of the many searches he had participated in. I didn't break anything myself, he says, but I didn't stop it either. I just stood there and let it happen. This admission marked a turning point in the interviews. For the first time, Andrei began to confront his own complicity, acknowledging that his inaction was as much a part of the harm as the orders he followed. They didn't have to accuse me of anything, he says. The facts spoke for themselves. The officers also challenged him on the idea of loyalty. They pointed out that the same unit he had fought to protect had abandoned him when he was injured, leaving him to die on the battlefield. They asked me why I was still trying to defend people who didn't care about me, Andrei says. And honestly, I couldn't come up with a good reason. These contradictions left Andrei in a state of emotional turmoil. The carefully constructed narrative he had relied on to justify his actions was falling apart, piece by piece. It was like standing in front of a mirror and seeing someone you don't recognize, he says. I didn't know what was left of me when all the lies were stripped away. By the end of the interviews, Andrei's defenses were gone. He could no longer claim ignorance or innocence. The contradictions in his story had been laid bare, forcing him to confront not just the truth about the war, but the truth about himself. I realized I wasn't a victim, he says. I was a participant, and that's something I'll have to live with. This process of unraveling wasn't just a reckoning for Andrei. It was a lesson in the power of truth. For all the propaganda and justifications he had clung to, the facts remained unyielding, cutting through the facade he had built. And in their clarity, they left him with one undeniable conclusion. His actions had consequences, and no amount of rationalization could erase them. Sitting in the quiet of his holding cell, Andrei Stadnik found his thoughts returning again and again to the faces of the civilians he had encountered during his time in Ukraine. These weren't the nameless, faceless figures that the propaganda had painted them to be. They were real people. Mothers, fathers, children, each with their own lives now irreversibly changed by the war. For Andrei, these reflections marked one of the most difficult parts of his captivity, the slow, painful reckoning with the harm he had helped inflict. "I keep thinking about the old woman in the village," Andrei says quietly. "She begged us not to destroy her home. She said, 'We've already lost so much.' And yet, we left her with nothing." That woman's face haunted him, but she wasn't alone. Andrei remembered the children who had watched him and his comrades with wide, fearful eyes, clutching at their mothers as the soldiers marched through their villages. He thought of the young boy who had stood defiantly in the middle of the road, pretending to hold a rifle, his face a mixture of innocence and anger. "He was just a kid," Andrei says, "but he looked at me like I was the enemy." Andrei's reflections weren't limited to individuals. He began to consider the broader impact of the war on the communities he had moved through. Homes destroyed, schools turned into rubble, fields left barren, all in the name of a mission that now felt hollow to him. "We weren't helping them," he says bitterly. "We were taking everything from them, their homes, their safety, their hope." One of the most painful realizations for Andrei was the role he had played in perpetuating this suffering. While he hadn't directly pulled the trigger or issued the orders, his presence alone had been enough to instill fear. "I didn't have to break down doors or fire my weapon," he says. "Just being there in their villages with my uniform and my gun, that was enough to make them feel unsafe." Andrei recalls a specific moment during a house search when a young girl, no older than 6, had clung to her mother's leg, her eyes wide with terror. "She looked at me like I was a monster," he says. "I wanted to tell her I wasn't there to hurt her, but what could I say? She didn't understand my words, only my actions." These memories were compounded by the stories Andrei had heard from his captors. During his interrogations, they spoke of displaced families, destroyed infrastructure, and the countless civilians who had been forced to flee their homes. For Andrei, hearing these accounts from the perspective of those who had suffered the most was a sobering experience. "They didn't tell these stories to make me feel guilty," he says. "They just wanted me to understand the truth. The suffering wasn't confined to physical destruction." Andrei began to grasp the psychological toll the war had taken on civilians. The constant fear, the uncertainty, the loss of loved ones. He thought of the elderly man who had sat silently on his porch as soldiers combed through his home, his face devoid of emotion. He didn't say a word, Andrei recalls, but his eyes said everything. He was tired, defeated. These reflections forced Andrei to confront a question he had avoided since the beginning of the war. What had they truly accomplished? The answer, he realized, was nothing. "We weren't liberating anyone," he says. "We weren't making anything better. All we did was bring destruction." This newfound understanding left Andrei with a profound sense of shame. He thought of his son back home, imagining what the boy would think if he knew the full extent of his father's actions. "I didn't want to be a villain in his eyes," Andrei says. "But how could I not be, after everything I'd done?" Andrei's reflections on civilian suffering weren't just about guilt. They were about seeing the humanity in those he had been taught to view as enemies. It was a painful but necessary step in his journey toward understanding the true cost of the war. Not just for those who fought in it, but for those who had no choice but to endure it. "We were told they were the bad guys," Andrei says. "But the truth is, they were just people. And we took so much from them." As Andrei Stadnik sat in captivity, reflecting on the choices that had led him to this point, he began to see how deeply the machinery of propaganda had shaped his life. It wasn't just the grand speeches or the dramatic headlines. It was the quiet, insidious messages that had seeped into his everyday thinking, blurring the lines between truth and fabrication. "We didn't think we were being lied to," Andrei says. "It felt like the truth, because it was everywhere." The propaganda began long before he joined the Ahmat Battalion. In the years leading up to the war, Andriy had been exposed to a constant stream of state-controlled media, portraying Ukraine as a failed state overrun by extremists and neo-Nazis. These narratives painted a picture of a nation in chaos, one that needed Russia's intervention to restore order and protect Russian-speaking communities. They made it sound like we were the heroes, Andriy explains, that we had a duty to step in and help. The messaging was pervasive, woven into television broadcasts, news articles, and even casual conversations. Andriy recalls watching state news channels that highlighted only the most extreme or violent elements of the conflict in Ukraine. Images of riots, nationalist rallies, and clashes were carefully selected to create a sense of urgency and fear. They showed us the worst, Andriy says, and they made sure we believed it was the whole story. When Andriy signed up for the battalion, the rhetoric became even more direct. During training, he and the other recruits were bombarded with ideological briefings that framed their mission as a moral obligation. They were told that they were liberators, fighting to protect innocent civilians from a corrupt and dangerous regime. They made it sound noble, Andriy recalls, like we were on the right side of history. The battalion's leaders leaned heavily on patriotic themes, evoking the sacrifices of past generations to inspire loyalty. Recruits were reminded of Russia's victories in World War II, the enduring fight against fascism, and the duty of every Russian to defend the motherland. They used our history against us, Andriy says. They made us feel like we were part of something bigger, something worth dying for. But the propaganda wasn't limited to words. Andriy remembers how the battalion controlled access to outside information, ensuring that the soldiers were exposed only to approved narratives. Phones were confiscated, access to independent news sources was restricted, and any dissenting voices were quickly silenced. We were in a bubble, Andriy says. We only heard what they wanted us to hear. This control extended to the battlefield. After every mission, commanders would frame the outcomes in ways that bolstered the battalion's image, regardless of the reality on the ground. A failed operation was described as a strategic withdrawal. The discovery of outdated weapons was spun as a major success. They lied to us as much as they lied to everyone else, Andriy says. And we believed it, because we wanted to believe it. The longer Andriy spent in captivity, the more he began to see the cracks in the propaganda he had once accepted without question. He thought about the promises that had been made to him, the high pay, the easy role as an instructor, the respect and purpose he was supposed to gain. None of it had materialized. Instead, he had been thrown into a chaotic and brutal conflict, abandoned by his comrades, and left to reconcile his actions with the truth. The most painful realization for Andriy was how deeply the propaganda had shaped not just his decisions, but his sense of self. They made us think we were the good guys, he says. But when you're standing in someone else's home, tearing it apart, it's hard to hold on to that belief. Andriy also began to see how the propaganda had dehumanized the people of Ukraine, turning them into caricatures rather than individuals. The rhetoric about neo-Nazis and extremists had stripped away their humanity, making it easier for soldiers like him to justify their actions. They weren't people to us, Andriy admits. They were enemies. And that made it easier to do what we did. In captivity, Andriy had access to new information, stories from his captors, reports from the outside world, and even snippets of independent news. The contrast between these accounts and the narratives he had been fed was staggering. It was like waking up from a dream, he says. You start to see the lies for what they are, and it's terrifying. The machinery of propaganda had done more than manipulate Andriy's beliefs. It had stolen his ability to question, to doubt, to think critically. It had turned him into a cog in a larger system, one that thrived on fear, division, and blind loyalty. I see it now, he says, how it works, how it pulls you in. And I hate that I let it happen. For Andriy, understanding the role of propaganda in his journey was a bitter but necessary step. It forced him to confront not just the lies he had believed, but the consequences of those lies for himself, the civilians he had encountered, and the people he had fought beside. It's easy to believe what they tell you, he says, but the truth is always harder. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. In the quiet moments of his captivity, Andriy Stadnik found himself haunted by a single, inescapable question. Could he have made different choices? The weight of his decisions pressed heavily on him, each memory of the war layered with regret, and the bitter realization of what those choices had cost, not only for himself, but for others. You don't think about the consequences when you're in the moment, Andriy says. But afterward, that's all you can think about. One of Andriy's deepest regrets was leaving his son behind to join the war. He had told himself that enlisting was a way to provide a better future, a noble sacrifice for his family's stability. But now, sitting alone in a foreign land, the logic of that decision felt hollow. I told myself it was for him, Andrei says. But how does losing his father make his life better? Andrei thought often of the last time he had seen his son. It was a chilly morning in Moscow, and he had promised to call as soon as he arrived at his new job. He hadn't mentioned that the job involved a battalion or that he would be crossing into a war zone. I didn't want him to worry, Andrei says quietly. But now I wonder if I should have told him the truth. At least then he'd understand why I wasn't coming home. His regrets extended far beyond his family. Andrei often replayed the missions he had participated in, searching for moments where he could have done something, anything, to lessen the harm inflicted on the civilians caught in the crossfire. I should have spoken up, he says. I should have refused the orders. But I didn't. I just stood there and let it happen. One memory that tormented him was of a young boy in a village his unit had occupied. The boy had stood outside his home, clutching a broken toy, as soldiers marched past. Andrei had caught his eye for a brief moment, seeing a mixture of fear and defiance in the child's expression. I remember thinking, this boy will hate us forever, Andrei says. And I can't blame him. Andrei also regretted the camaraderie he had failed to foster with his comrades. The dysfunction and mistrust within the battalion had left the soldiers divided, each man looking out for himself. There had been moments when Andrei could have stepped up, offered words of encouragement, diffused arguments, or shown compassion. But he had stayed silent. I was too focused on surviving, he admits. I didn't think about what kind of leader or friend I could have been. The betrayal he felt from his unit, their abandonment of him when he was injured, only deepened his sense of regret. I trusted them, Andrei says, and they left me. But maybe they felt the same way about me. Maybe they thought I would have done the same if it were them. The thought unsettled him, forcing him to confront the ways his own self-preservation had shaped his actions. One of the most painful aspects of Andrei's regrets was his realization that the war itself had no justification. The promises of liberation, the noble rhetoric, the sense of purpose, all of it had been a lie. We weren't fighting for something greater, Andrei says. We were just fighting. And people were dying for nothing. As these thoughts consumed him, Andrei found himself questioning not just his actions, but his very identity. Who was he now, stripped of the uniform and the justifications he had clung to? What did it mean to be a soldier if the cause was unjust and the actions unforgivable? I don't know if I can ever make peace with it, Andrei says. How do you forgive yourself for something like this? Despite the depth of his regret, Andrei also recognized the importance of confronting these feelings. His time in captivity had forced him to reflect in ways he never had before, to see his actions through the eyes of those he had wronged. It's not enough to feel sorry, he says. You have to understand what you've done, really understand it. And then you have to live with it. For Andrei, the weight of his regrets was a reminder of the humanity he had lost in the chaos of war, and the humanity he was struggling to reclaim. I can't undo what I've done, he says, but maybe I can learn from it. Maybe I can be better if I ever get the chance. As he sits in his cell, Andrei knows that his regrets will follow him for the rest of his life. But in facing them, he hopes to find some semblance of redemption, however small. I don't deserve forgiveness, he says, but I'll keep trying to earn it anyway. The chaos in command within the Amat Battalion was one of the most glaring issues Andrei Stadnik experienced during his time in Ukraine. What had been sold to him as a disciplined, well-organized military unit was, in reality, a disjointed collection of individuals operating under conflicting orders and a lack of clear leadership. For Andrei, this dysfunction wasn't just frustrating. It was life-threatening. There was no structure, Andrei explains. Every squad seemed to be doing its own thing, with no real coordination from the top. The officers rarely communicated with one another, and when they did, their directives often contradicted previous orders. Soldiers on the ground were left to figure things out for themselves, creating confusion and unnecessary risks during operations. You could be told to hold a position in the morning, Andrei recalls, and by the afternoon, someone else would tell you to abandon it without any explanation. The problems began at the highest levels of command. Senior officers, who were supposed to provide strategic guidance, were often absent from the field, relying on vague radio transmissions to issue instructions. When they did appear, their focus seemed to be more on maintaining appearances than addressing the needs of their troops. It felt like they were more concerned about writing reports than actually leading, Andrei says. We were just numbers to them, casualty figures, mission statistics, nothing more. This lack of leadership trickled down to the lower ranks, where mid-level officers struggled to manage their own units. Many were inexperienced, having been hastily promoted to fill gaps in the chain of command. Others were simply indifferent, doing the bare minimum to avoid scrutiny. Andrew recalls one platoon leader who spent most of his time avoiding the front lines, delegating his responsibilities to subordinates without offering any support. He was more interested in keeping himself safe than leading us. Andrew says, the disorganization extended to the battalion's logistics. Supplies were poorly managed, with essential items like food, water, and ammunition often arriving late, or not at all. Soldiers frequently had to share equipment or scavenge for resources in the field. We were supposed to be an elite unit, Andrew says, but half the time, we didn't even have enough bullets to go around. One of the most chaotic moments Andrew experienced came during a joint operation with another unit. The plan was to secure a bridge that served as a vital supply route, but miscommunication between the two units led to a disastrous outcome. Andrew's unit was ordered to hold their position on one side of the bridge, while the other unit was supposed to secure the opposite side. However, the other unit never arrived, leaving Andrew and his comrades exposed to an unexpected counterattack. We were completely unprepared, Andrew says. We thought we had backup, but it never came. The resulting firefight left several soldiers wounded, and the bridge was ultimately lost. When Andrew's unit retreated, they discovered that the other unit had been given conflicting orders to reinforce a different location. It was a failure on every level, he says. And no one took responsibility. The chaos wasn't limited to the battlefield. Back at the staging areas, the lack of discipline and accountability created a toxic environment among the soldiers. Arguments over resources and shifts were common, and disputes often escalated into physical altercations. Andrew remembers one night when two soldiers got into a brawl over a pack of cigarettes, leaving both bloodied and bruised. There was no one to step in, he says. The officers didn't care, and the soldiers knew it. What frustrated Andrew the most was the pervasive sense of indifference from the leadership. Soldiers' concerns were routinely ignored, and any attempts to raise issues were met with dismissiveness or outright hostility. They didn't want to hear about the problems, Andrew says. They just wanted us to do our jobs and keep quiet. The chaos in command wasn't just a logistical failure. It was a betrayal of the trust that Andrew and his comrades had placed in their leaders. We were out there risking our lives, he says. The least they could have done was give us a plan that made sense. For Andrew, the disorganization and incompetence of the battalion's leadership became symbolic of the larger flaws in the war effort. It wasn't just about poor planning or a lack of resources. It was about a system that prioritized appearances over the lives of the men fighting on the ground. We were disposable to them, he says, and that's something I'll never forget. The cracks in the Amat battalion structure weren't just limited to poor leadership and disorganization. As the weeks turned into months, Andrew Stadnik began to hear whispers of betrayal and desertion within their ranks, stories that highlighted the desperation and moral collapse of the men fighting alongside him. These accounts weren't just rumors. They were a stark reflection of a battalion unraveling under the weight of its mission. Trust was already fragile, Andrew recalls. But when the first rumors of desertion started, it felt like the final blow. No one knew who they could rely on anymore. One of the earliest stories Andrew remembers hearing was about a squad leader who had abandoned his post during an ambush. According to the account, the squad had been pinned down by Ukrainian forces, and the leader had used the chaos to slip away, leaving his men to fend for themselves. The survivors made it back to camp, but the squad leader was never seen again. They said he ran into the woods and kept going. Andrew says, "It shook everyone. If a leader could do that, what chance did the rest of us have?" Desertion wasn't limited to individual acts of cowardice. Entire groups of soldiers reportedly disappeared during missions, vanishing without a trace. Andrew recalls one such incident when a patrol failed to return from a routine reconnaissance operation. Initially, it was assumed they had been captured or killed, but later reports suggested they had crossed enemy lines intentionally, seeking safety and surrender. No one wanted to talk about it, Andrew says, but we all knew it had happened. The sense of betrayal extended beyond desertion. Supplies meant for the troops were often stolen or misappropriated, creating resentment and suspicion within the battalion. Andrew remembers a time when a shipment of rations arrived, only to find that half of it had been pilfered. We were starving, and someone was lining their pockets, he says bitterly. It wasn't just about survival. It was about greed. The theft wasn't limited to food. Ammunition, medical supplies, and even personal belongings often went missing, further eroding what little camaraderie remained among the soldiers. You couldn't leave anything unattended, Andrei explains. People were desperate, and desperation makes thieves out of everyone. One of the most shocking stories Andrei encountered involved a soldier who had turned on his own comrades during a retreat. The battalion was under heavy fire, and in the confusion, the soldier had reportedly shot another in an argument over who would carry the last remaining medical kit. It was unthinkable, Andrei says, to turn your weapon on one of your own. It showed just how far things had fallen apart. Even more disturbing were the accounts of officers abandoning their men. Andrei remembers one operation where a platoon was left stranded after their commander fled with the transport vehicles. The soldiers had no choice but to march back on foot, carrying their wounded for miles. They were furious, Andrei says, but what could they do? No one was held accountable. These stories, whether firsthand or whispered through the ranks, deepened Andrei's disillusionment with the battalion and the war itself. Each new account of betrayal or desertion added to the growing sense of isolation and distrust among the soldiers. You start to feel like it's every man for himself, Andrei says. The idea of loyalty or brotherhood becomes meaningless. For Andrei, the stories of betrayal weren't just about individual failures. They were a symptom of a larger problem. The war had stripped away any sense of purpose or unity, leaving the soldiers to fend for themselves in a system that had already failed them. We weren't fighting for anything real, Andrei says. And when you realize that, it's hard to keep going. Yet, even in the midst of this moral collapse, Andrei found himself grappling with his own sense of responsibility. He hadn't deserted, hadn't stolen supplies, hadn't turned on his comrades, but he also hadn't done anything to stop it. I kept my head down, he admits. I thought if I just focused on surviving, it would all blow over. But it didn't. The stories of betrayal and desertion haunted Andrei long after his capture. They were reminders of how quickly the bonds of loyalty could disintegrate under pressure, and how the war had turned even the most basic human connections into casualties. In the end, we were just trying to survive, he says. And that meant trusting no one. As the days in captivity passed, Andrei Stadnik found himself reflecting more deeply on the purpose of the war he had been a part of. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that the mission he had once been convinced was necessary, if not noble, was, in truth, utterly futile. We weren't accomplishing anything, he says. It was chaos disguised as purpose. Andrei began his reckoning with the promises he had been given during recruitment. He had been told that his role in the Akhmat battalion was vital, that they were liberating oppressed people and fighting a righteous cause. Yet, every interaction with Ukrainian civilians had contradicted this narrative. They didn't want us there, Andrei recalls. We weren't liberators. We were intruders. One moment that stood out to him was an operation in a small village where his unit had been tasked with securing the area. They had entered expecting resistance, but found only a few frightened families huddled in their homes. Andrei remembered the looks on their faces. Not gratitude or relief, but anger and fear. I realized then that our presence didn't make anything better, he says. It only made things worse. The missions themselves often felt arbitrary, their objectives unclear or meaningless. Andrei recalls being sent to hold positions that were soon abandoned or to secure resources that were destroyed in the process. It was like we were moving pieces on a board without knowing the rules, he says. Nothing we did seemed to have a lasting impact. Even the victories felt hollow. After one particularly grueling operation, Andrei's unit captured a small weapons cache. The commanders praised it as a major success, but the cache contained little more than a few outdated rifles and scattered ammunition. We lost people for that, Andrei says. Good men gone. And for what? The lack of long-term strategy only added to the sense of futility. Orders were often given without explanation, and once a mission was completed, the unit was rarely informed of its significance. We didn't know if we were making progress or just going in circles, Andrei explains, and the commanders didn't seem to care. This aimlessness was compounded by the growing realization that the battalion itself was falling apart. The leadership was disorganized, supplies were scarce, and morale was at an all-time low. How could we win a war when we couldn't even keep ourselves together? Andrei asks. The futility of the mission wasn't just a matter of poor planning or execution. It was embedded in the very fabric of the war itself. Andrei began to question the broader purpose of the conflict, wondering why it had started in the first place. We were told it was about protecting Russian speakers, he says. But the people we were protecting didn't want us there. They just wanted us to leave. Andrei also thought about the cost of the war, not just in lives lost, but in the destruction it left behind. Villages reduced to rubble, Families torn apart, entire communities displaced. We weren't building anything, he says. We were tearing everything down. This realization hit Andre hardest when he considered the soldiers who had fought and died alongside him. Many of them had believed in the mission, trusting that their sacrifices would mean something. But now, Andre saw those sacrifices as wasted. They gave their lives for a lie, he says. And that's something I'll never be able to forget. The futility of the mission also forced Andre to confront his own role in the war. He had joined out of desperation, believing that he could provide for his family while staying out of direct combat. But the choices he had made, whether out of necessity or ignorance, had contributed to the devastation. I thought I could be a bystander, he says. But there are no bystanders in war. You're either part of the problem, or you're not there at all. In the end, Andre's reflections on the futility of the mission left him with a profound sense of regret and disillusionment. The war he had been a part of wasn't about liberation or protection. It was about power, control, and propaganda. And in the pursuit of those goals, countless lives had been shattered, including his own. We weren't fighting for anything real, Andre says. We were just fighting. And now, looking back, I can't even tell you why. As Andre Stadnik reflected on his journey, one truth became increasingly clear. Complicity in the war was not just about following orders or carrying out missions. It was about the choice to stay silent. In his heart, he knew that he had been complicit in a system that inflicted suffering on innocent people, and the weight of that realization was unbearable. It wasn't just the things I did, he says. It was the things I allowed to happen. Complicity, Andre realized, had many faces. It was in the moments when he turned away from the cries of civilians during a raid. It was in the quiet acceptance of orders that he knew were wrong. It was in the camaraderie of soldiers laughing around a fire, ignoring the destruction they had left behind. You tell yourself you're just doing your job, Andre says. But deep down, you know that's not enough. One of the most painful memories for Andre was of a family he had encountered during a sweep and secure mission. The father had pleaded with the soldiers not to search their home, explaining that his wife was unwell and couldn't handle the stress. Andre had stood by silently as his comrades pushed past the man, overturning furniture and scattering belongings. I didn't stop them, he says quietly. I didn't even speak up. I just stood there. This passivity, Andre realized, was part of what made complicity so insidious. It wasn't about overt acts of violence or aggression. It was about the choice to do nothing. You convince yourself that you're not responsible because you didn't pull the trigger, he says. But standing by and letting it happen, that's complicity too. The cost of this complicity became clearer as Andre reflected on the broader impact of his actions. He thought about the civilians who had been displaced, their lives uprooted by the war. He thought about the villages that had been turned into battlegrounds, leaving nothing but rubble and ashes in their wake. Every mission, every raid, every order we followed, it all added up, he says. And the people who paid the price weren't the ones who gave the orders. They were the ones who had no choice. Andre also began to see how his complicity extended to his fellow soldiers. By staying silent, he had allowed the dysfunction and mistrust within the battalion to fester. He hadn't challenged the commanders who sent them on dangerous missions without adequate preparation. He hadn't spoken up when supplies were stolen or when soldiers turned on one another. I thought it wasn't my place to say anything, he says. But maybe if I had, things could have been different. The cost of complicity wasn't just external. It was internal as well. Andre realized that every moment of silence, every decision to look the other way, had taken something from him. It had eroded his sense of self, leaving behind a man he barely recognized. You lose a piece of yourself every time you compromise your values, he says, and by the end, there's nothing left. One of the hardest things for Andre to accept was the realization that complicity wasn't always a conscious choice. It was something that crept in gradually, masked by routine and rationalization. You don't wake up one day and decide to be complicit, he explains. It happens little by little, with every order you follow and every question you don't ask. Yet, despite the enormity of his regret, Andre also saw his reflections on complicity as an opportunity to learn. He began to understand that acknowledging his role in the war was a necessary step toward taking responsibility. You can't change what you don't admit, he says. And for too long, I pretended I wasn't part of the problem. The cost of complicity, Andre realized, wasn't just measured in the lives that were lost or the destruction that was wrought. It was measured in the humanity that was sacrificed along the way. For him, coming to terms with that cost was the first step in trying to reclaim what had been lost. I can't undo what I've done, he says, but maybe I can make sure it doesn't happen again. As Andrei Stadnik sat in his cell, he found himself questioning the two forces that had driven so many of his choices, nationalism and propaganda. Both had been presented to him as undeniable truths, woven into the fabric of his identity and the justification for his actions. Yet, as he reflected on the war and his role in it, he began to see them as tools of manipulation, powerful, dangerous, and deeply flawed. It's easy to believe you're fighting for something greater, Andrei says. Nationalism makes it feel like your actions have meaning, like you're part of something bigger than yourself. But it's also a way to blind you to the consequences. Andrei thought back to the rhetoric he had been fed before joining the Amat Battalion. The speeches, the news reports, the patriotic symbols, they all painted a picture of a Russia under threat, a nation standing up against external enemies to protect its people and its heritage. They told us we were defending our history, our language, our culture, Andrei recalls. But looking back, I see it wasn't about protection. It was about control. The propaganda that supported this nationalism had been equally pervasive. Every television broadcast, every article, every briefing was designed to stoke fear and anger. Fear of an enemy that supposedly threatened Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and anger at a world that didn't understand Russia's righteous cause. They didn't just tell us what to think, Andrei says. They told us how to feel. And we believed them. Andrei began to see how this combination of nationalism and propaganda created a powerful narrative, one that was hard to question. It framed the war as a moral imperative, a fight against fascism and oppression. It dehumanized the enemy, turning civilians into collaborators and resistance fighters into extremists. You don't see people anymore, Andrei explains. You see enemies, and that makes it easier to justify anything. But in captivity, Andrei had been exposed to a different perspective. His captors, the Ukrainian soldiers he had been told were the enemy, spoke about their love for their homeland and their determination to defend it. Their words mirrored the rhetoric he had heard about his own mission, forcing him to confront the similarities. They were fighting for their country, just like we said we were fighting for ours, Andrei says. But their fight felt real. Ours didn't. This realization led Andrei to question the very foundation of the nationalism he had once embraced. He began to see how it had been weaponized, not to protect his people, but to serve the interests of those in power. It wasn't about us, he says. It was about them. The ones giving the orders, the ones writing the speeches. They used our pride against us. Andrei also reflected on the role of propaganda in suppressing dissent and critical thinking. He thought about the lack of independent media, the confiscation of soldiers' phones, and the controlled narratives that dominated every conversation. They made sure we never heard the other side, he says. Because if we did, we might start asking questions. The more Andrei thought about it, the more he realized how deeply nationalism and propaganda had shaped his identity. They had given him a sense of purpose, a reason to fight, and a framework for understanding the world. But they had also blinded him to the realities of the war, the suffering of civilians, and the contradictions in his own actions. They gave me something to believe in, Andrei says, but it was all a lie. These reflections left Andrei with a deep sense of betrayal, not just by his commanders or the system that had sent him to war, but by himself. He had allowed himself to be swept up in the rhetoric, to believe the lies, and to act on them without question. I thought I was doing the right thing, he says, but now I see that I was just a pawn. For Andrei, understanding the power of nationalism and propaganda was a painful but necessary step in his journey. It forced him to confront the ways he had been manipulated, to see how easily pride and fear could be turned into tools of war. They made me think I was part of something great, he says, but all I was part of was destruction. As Andrei reflects on these forces, he hopes others will learn from his experience. Nationalism can be a good thing, he says, but when it's used to divide, to dehumanize, to justify harm, that's when it becomes dangerous, and that's when you have to question it. The lessons of Andrei Stadnik's journey are stark, complex, and deeply human. As he sits in captivity, reflecting on the choices that led him to this point, his story becomes more than just a personal reckoning. It is a cautionary tale about the power of manipulation, the consequences of blind loyalty, and the importance of questioning the narratives we are fed. The first lesson, Andrei says, is that silence is dangerous. It's not enough to avoid doing harm yourself. When you stay silent in the face of wrong, you're still part of it. Andrei's silence during the raids on villages, the dysfunction in the Amat Battalion, and the suffering of civilians haunts him deeply. He understands now that complicity is not just about action. It is about the absence of resistance. I thought staying quiet would protect me, he says, but all it did was make me part of the problem. His story also reveals the insidious nature of propaganda and how it can erode critical thinking. Andrei reflects on how easily he accepted the narratives presented to him, never pausing to question their validity or seek alternative perspectives. They told me what I wanted to hear, he says, that we were the heroes, that our actions were justified, and I believed it because it was easier than asking hard questions. The danger of propaganda, Andrei realizes, is its ability to turn ordinary people into tools of destruction. By framing the war as a moral necessity and the enemy as subhuman, it allowed soldiers like him to rationalize their actions, no matter how harmful. You stop seeing the people you're hurting, he says. You see them as obstacles, threats, problems to solve. Andrei's tale also underscores the fragility of trust in systems that fail to prioritize humanity. He remembers the betrayal he felt when his commanders abandoned him, and the anger that simmered among his comrades as resources were stolen and lives were wasted. When the people in charge don't value yourself, he says. And when you don't value yourself, he says, and when you don't value yourself, you make choices you'll regret. Perhaps the most important lesson Andrei takes from his journey is the need to humanize others, even in the midst of conflict. He reflects on the moments when he locked eyes with civilians, saw their fear, and chose to look away. He thinks of the Ukrainian soldiers who treated him with unexpected kindness after his capture. They had every reason to hate me, he says, but they showed me compassion. That's something I'll carry with me forever. Andrei hopes his story will serve as a warning to others who find themselves caught in systems that demand blind loyalty or unquestioning obedience. He wants people to understand the importance of critical thinking, of standing up for what is right, even when it's difficult. It's not enough to say, I was just following orders, he says. We all have a choice, even if it doesn't feel like it in the moment. For Andrei, the ultimate lesson of his tale is the cost of losing oneself to a cause that isn't rooted in truth or humanity. He speaks of the pieces of himself he gave away during the war, his integrity, his empathy, his ability to see others as people rather than enemies. I lost so much, he says. And for what? A paycheck? A lie? None of it was worth it. Despite the weight of his regrets, Andrei also sees his reflections as an opportunity for growth. He believes that by confronting his mistakes, by acknowledging the harm he caused, he can begin to rebuild. I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself, he says, but I want to try. And maybe, if I share what I've learned, someone else won't make the same mistakes. Andrei's tale is a reminder of the fragility of morality in the face of war and the resilience it takes to reclaim one's humanity. It is a story of loss, but also of hope. The hope that even in the darkest moments, there is a chance to learn, to grow, and to do better. The lessons are simple. Andrei says, question what you're told, speak up when you see wrong, and never forget that the people on the other side are just that, people. As the interview concluded, Andrei Stadnik was asked if he had any final thoughts, any words to leave behind as a reflection of his journey. He hesitated for a moment, the weight of everything he had experienced pressing down on him. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but resolute, filled with the clarity of a man who had spent countless hours grappling with his conscience. I came here thinking I was doing the right thing, Andrei began. I told myself it was about protecting people, about doing my duty. But the truth is, I didn't know what I was fighting for. And now, looking back, I see the harm I've caused, not just to others, but to myself. Andrei paused, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. I've lost so much, he continued. I lost my chance to be a father my son could look up to. I lost the respect of the people I was supposed to help. And I lost myself in the process. His tone grew heavier as he spoke about the civilians who had been caught in the crossfire of a war they didn't ask for. I wish I could tell every one of them how sorry I am, he said. For the fear I caused, for the destruction I allowed, for the silence I kept when I should have spoken up. Andrei then turned his attention to the soldiers who had fought alongside him. To my comrades, he said, I wish I had been stronger for you. I wish I had challenged the things that were wrong instead of just going along with them. We all deserve better. Better leadership, better choices, better lives. He looked up at the interviewer, his eyes filled with both regret and a hint of hope. But the most important thing I've learned is that regret isn't enough. It's not enough to feel sorry or to wish things had been different. You have to take what you've learned and try to make something good out of it. Andrei's final words were not about seeking forgiveness or justifying his actions. Instead, they were a call to others to learn from his mistakes. "If my story can stop just one person from making the same choices I did," he said, "then maybe, in some small way, it will mean something." As the session ended, Andry sat back, his shoulders slumped but his voice steady. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said softly, "but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be better, because that's the least I can do." As the interviewer sat across from Andry Stadnik, listening to his final words, they couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: pity, frustration, and a cold acknowledgement of the broader truths Andry's story revealed. To the interviewer, Andry was both a product of his environment and a participant in its horrors. A man whose regrets now stood as a testament to the futility of his actions. The interviewer reflected on Andry's demeanor throughout their conversations. He had arrived guarded, his words measured, his narrative carefully constructed to paint himself as a man without choice, a pawn in a larger game. But as the sessions unfolded, cracks appeared in that facade. Bit by bit, the layers of justification peeled away, revealing a man grappling with the enormity of what he had done. He wanted to seem innocent, the interviewer would later recall, but innocence isn't silence, and silence isn't harmless. Andry's contradictions stood out most starkly. He claimed he hadn't believed in the mission, yet he had followed orders without question. He insisted he was just an instructor, yet the evidence showed him participating in raids. The interviewer pressed on these points not to humiliate him, but to expose the cognitive dissonance that so many soldiers like him seemed to carry. He wasn't unique, the interviewer thought. He was a reflection of the system that created him. As Andry spoke of his regrets, the interviewer couldn't ignore the weight of his sincerity. There was no doubt that Andry was haunted by his choices, but the interviewer also understood that regret alone didn't undo the damage. For the people whose homes were destroyed, whose families were torn apart, his regret means little, they reflected. It's not justice. It's just a man coming to terms with himself. Still, the interviewer couldn't dismiss the significance of Andry's transformation. The man sitting before them was no longer the soldier who had crossed the border into Ukraine, convinced he was doing his duty. He was a man stripped of illusions, painfully aware of his complicity, and desperate to make sense of it. He's trying, the interviewer thought. And that's more than most. For the interviewer, Andry's story wasn't just about one man's journey. It was a microcosm of the larger forces at play: propaganda, blind nationalism, and the machinery of war that turns ordinary people into agents of destruction. Andry's experiences were a reminder of how easily individuals could be swept up in a system that demanded obedience at the cost of morality. He wasn't born a villain, the interviewer mused, but in trying to survive, he became one. As the interview concluded, the interviewer reflected on their own role in the process. They weren't there to judge, but to document, to capture the human side of the war, even in its ugliest moments. Andry's story, with all its contradictions and complexities, was an essential piece of that puzzle. People need to see this, they thought. Not just his actions, but the forces that shaped him. Only then can we understand how to stop it from happening again. The interviewer's final thoughts were pragmatic but tinged with hope. They didn't expect Andry to find redemption overnight, nor did they believe his words would erase the harm he had caused. But they did see value in his willingness to confront the truth. Acknowledging the past is the first step, they thought. If he can take the next steps, maybe his story can mean something. As they watched Andry being led back to his holding cell, the interviewer felt a strange mix of closure and lingering questions. Andry's journey wasn't over, and neither was theirs. But for now, the story had been told. A story of choices, consequences, and the fragile line between victim and perpetrator. The story of Andry Stadnik is not just a tale of one man's journey through war. It's a mirror held up to all of us, reflecting the choices we make, the systems we allow, and the truths we avoid. As his tale comes to a close, it leaves behind questions that demand answers and challenges that demand action. Andry's experience is a reminder of the cost of silence in the face of injustice. His complicity wasn't born of malice, but of a failure to question, to speak out, to resist. And that failure came at a cost, not just to himself, but to the civilians whose lives were shattered by the actions of his battalion, and to the comrades who suffered alongside him in a war that lacked any clear purpose. The call to action begins with critical thinking. Andry's story reveals the dangers of blindly accepting the narratives we are given, whether they come from governments, institutions, or leaders. It's easy to believe what we're told when it's wrapped in patriotism or promises of security. But it's harder, and far more necessary, to question those narratives, to seek out the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. His story also calls on us to see the humanity in others, even in times of division and conflict. The people Andrei was taught to see as enemies turned out to be ordinary men, women, and children, caught in the crossfire of a war they didn't choose. His reflections challenge us to look beyond labels, beyond propaganda, and to recognize the shared humanity that unites us all. Andrei's regrets remind us of the importance of individual responsibility. In war, as in life, the choices we make, what we do, what we allow, what we ignore, shape not just our own lives, but the lives of those around us. Andrei's silence in moments of moral compromise is a warning to all of us that passivity, too, has consequences. This story also calls for accountability, not just from individuals like Andrei, but from the systems and leaders that perpetuate harm. The chaos in the Amat Battalion, the manipulation of propaganda, and the blind pursuit of a war without justification all point to a larger failure, one that requires collective action to address. It's not enough to regret the past. We must work to ensure it doesn't repeat. But Andrei's story isn't just a cautionary tale. It's also a testament to the possibility of change. His willingness to confront his mistakes, to reflect on his role, and to share his experiences offers a glimmer of hope. It shows that even in the darkest moments, there is a chance to grow, to learn, and to make different choices moving forward. The reflection doesn't end with Andrei. It extends to all of us, inviting us to think about the systems we support, the truths we ignore, and the actions we take, or fail to take, when confronted with injustice. His story challenges us to ask ourselves, what would we do in his place? And what can we do now to prevent others from being placed in the same position? Andrei Stadnik's journey is over, but the lessons of his tale continue. It is a call to question, to empathize, to act. A call to resist the forces that divide us and to build a world where stories like his are no longer possible. Because, in the end, the power to change lies not in the hands of governments or armies. It lies in the choices each of us makes, every single day. And those choices start with reflection.